10 billionaires. 10 fortresses built from vaults, lawyers, guards, and the quiet certainty that money buys invincibility. 10 cracks that nobody saw coming, until they did. These stories never made the front pages of Forbes. They live in the fine print of court documents, in the yellowed margins of local newspapers, in the whispered warnings of security consultants who share them only with clients who are paying very close attention. If you are ready to learn the truth about the most audacious thefts ever perpetrated against the richest people on the planet, support this cycle with a like, and write in the comments which story struck you the most. It will inspire us to open new archives. What follows is not a celebration of crime. It is proof that no matter how high you build your walls, someone always finds the stairs. Story number 1. The Invisible Man Inside the Palace. There is a particular kind of arrogance that money manufactures over time. The way limestone manufactures stalactites, slowly, drip by drip, until what began as a practical structure becomes an ornamental monument to itself. By the 1990s, Ryoichi Sasakawa had built exactly that kind of monument. To understand what was stolen from Sasakawa, and how, you first have to understand what Sasakawa was. He was, depending on who you asked and in what decade, a philanthropist of extraordinary generosity, a former Class A war crime suspect who somehow escaped prosecution at the Tokyo trials, a powerboat racing magnate, a self-declared world's wealthiest fascist, and a man who once described himself in a full-page advertisement in the New York Times as the world's richest and most radical fascist. He was, in other words, a man who had long since stopped worrying about what other people thought of him. He had ascended to a plane of wealth and notoriety where consequence felt like a weather system that happened to other people. His wealth came primarily from the Japan Motorboat Racing Association, a quasi-governmental body that held a legal monopoly on motorboat racing betting throughout Japan. Imagine a country where gambling is largely illegal, and then imagine one man holds the keys to the one form of legal betting that generates revenues in the hundreds of billions of yen annually. That man was Sasakawa. The Nippon Foundation, through which he channeled his charitable work, grew into one of the largest private philanthropic organizations in the world, dispersing funds to causes ranging from leprosy treatment in Africa to maritime safety research. By the early 1990s, the Sasakawa family compound outside Tokyo was not merely a residence. It was a compound in the truest Cold War sense, a layered system of perimeters, staffed by private security personnel who worked in rotation, monitored by camera systems that were considered state-of-the-art for their era. Visitors were logged, movement was tracked. The family's art collection alone, spread across multiple properties, was insured for sums that would have made a mid-sized museum weep with envy. What made the theft that occurred over a period stretching from the late 1980s into the early 1990s so extraordinary and so deeply humiliating was not the method used to breach the perimeter. There was no breach. The perimeter was never touched. The thief was already inside. His name was Katsuhiko Ushijima, and he had worked for the Sasakawa household in a domestic capacity for years. In Japanese domestic service of that era, particularly among the wealthiest families, a trusted household employee occupied a strange position, closer to the family than any outsider, present during moments of vulnerability, privy to the rhythms of daily life in ways that no security camera could capture or any background check could quantify. Ushijima was not trusted in the abstract. He was trusted in the specific, granular, intimate way that only years of proximity can produce. He knew which rooms were checked and when. He knew which family members traveled on which days. He knew the small organizational habits of a household that had grown comfortable in its own security. What he did with that knowledge was methodical and patient, in a way that speaks to either extraordinary discipline or extraordinary desperation, perhaps both. Over the course of years, Ushijima removed items from the household's collection, one by one. Not the most spectacular pieces, not the ones that would be immediately noticed. He had studied, consciously or unconsciously, the psychology of a household so wealthy that the complete inventory of its holdings existed nowhere in a single, easily checked document. He took items from the margins of attention, from the spaces between formal inventories. Scrolls, lacquerware, small sculptural objects, ceremonial items of significant cultural value but modest visual footprint. Each one a piece that, in a home overflowing with the accumulated aesthetic wealth of decades, would not immediately announce its absence. One disappears from a side room and you think, was it moved? Was it sent for restoration? Is it in storage at the other property? The total value of what Ushijima removed over this period was, when eventually calculated, staggering. Estimates placed it in the range of hundreds of millions of yen. Some assessments suggested figures approaching or exceeding 1 billion yen when individual items were properly appraised. He had not robbed a vault. He had robbed the negative space of a collection too large to be fully known. What eventually unraveled him was not a clever investigation or a digital audit trail. It was the art market itself. Items of this provenance, pieces connected, however tenuously, to one of Japan's most prominent and controversial families, have a way of generating conversations in certain specialized markets. A dealer notices something. A scholar recognizes a piece. The quiet, interconnected world of Japanese antiquities and decorative arts has its own memory, and when objects begin surfacing in that world through channels that cannot quite account for their recent provenance, the memory begins to speak. Ushijima was eventually identified, prosecuted, and convicted, but the truly unsettling part of the story is not his guilt. It is the window it opened onto something the Sasakawa household would never publicly acknowledge in its full dimensions. The collection that had been robbed was so vast, so sprawling, so inadequately documented at the level of individual objects, that the family could not say with certainty what else might be missing. The theft that could be proven was almost certainly not the full extent of the theft that had occurred. Some portion of what Ushijima took may still be circulating in the market today, its origins lost in the comfortable anonymity of private Japanese collection. The deepest irony is architectural. Ryoichi Sasakawa spent decades and fortunes building walls. He understood external threat in the way that powerful men of his generation were trained to understand it, as something that comes from outside, from adversaries, from the hostile world beyond the perimeter. What he did not build, because perhaps no amount of money can build it, was a system of perfect attention. The thief was not outside the walls. He was inside the rooms, moving quietly between the objects, learning their weight and their silence. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics called ma, the meaningful void, the space between things that gives the things themselves their shape. What Ushijima exploited was the ma of enormous wealth, the inevitable gaps in attention that exist when the collection of objects has grown larger than the consciousness that could hold it all at once. In the void between knowing and not knowing, he built his own small fortune. Consider for a moment the sheer scale of what this implies about the nature of extraordinary wealth as a physical, material phenomenon. Most people, when they imagine a billionaire's private collection, picture something like a museum, curated, catalogued, each object bearing a small, invisible label in some imaginary internal registry, each shelf and alcove accounted for in a document that a trained professional updates on a regular schedule. This is not inaccurate for the most formally managed collections, but for the collections that accumulate organically, over decades, the way water accumulates at the base of a mountain, through gifts, through impulse purchases, through the slow accretion of objects acquired in the margins of business travel, through inheritance, through the transactions that occur when people of similar wealth and taste move through the same social circuits, the reality is often quite different. The Sasakawa household's collection was of this second, organic type, not poorly managed exactly, managed with the resources and systems appropriate to its historical moment, in a country whose conventions around the formal cataloging of private domestic collections were, in that era, less rigorous than they have since become. Objects were known and loved and arranged and appreciated, but known in the sense that a family knows the layout of the rooms it grew up in, intimately, experientially, in the flesh, rather than known in the sense of a database with unique identifiers, condition reports, and regular physical reconciliation checks. Ushijima understood this distinction better than anyone in the household because he was the person who moved through those rooms every day. He watched the family interact with the collection. He understood which objects occupied the foreground of attention and which lived in the peripheral vision of appreciation. He had spent years absorbing the specific emotional topography of the household's relationship to its own accumulated beauty. What he built from this understanding was, in essence, a mental map of the invisible, a map of all the objects that occupied the space between love and inventory. The pieces that everyone knew were there, but that no one would have been immediately able to confirm from memory if asked to enumerate them on a Tuesday morning in October. He did not target the centerpieces. He targeted the supporting cast, the objects that gave the rooms their atmosphere without anchoring anyone's specific, regular, conscious attention. The Japanese art market of that era, particularly for objects of historical significance that moved through informal rather than formal auction channels, had its own geography of discretion. There were dealers who asked careful questions, and dealers who asked careful questions only up to a certain point. Ushijima navigated this geography with the confidence of someone who understood that the objects he was moving carried no immediate alarm, no direct connection to a famous missing case, no international alert, no Interpol notice. They were simply beautiful things of uncertain recent history, available at prices that reflected their genuine quality without reflecting the premium that clear provenance would have commanded. The gap between the two prices, the price a properly provenanced object would achieve, and the price an object of uncertain recent custody would achieve, is where Ushijima's profit lived. He was not getting full value. He knew this. He was accepting a significant discount in exchange for the discretion that the market's lower, quieter tiers provided. And even at that discount, across years of consistent removal, the total was extraordinary. The psychological dimension of the story that never fully surfaces in the legal record is the question of when Ushijima decided. Was there a moment of deliberate calculation, a specific conscious crossing of a threshold? Or was it gradual, the slow recognition, accreting over months of trusted proximity, that the possibility existed, that the risk was manageable, that the system had a gap wide enough to walk through quietly with a scroll under one arm? The answer matters because it speaks to the nature of the threat that households of this kind actually face. Not the premeditated criminal who targets them from a distance, but the trusted intimate whose decision emerges slowly from the soil of opportunity and grows imperceptibly until it is fully formed. The next story, by contrast, involves a theft conducted entirely in the open, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, using nothing more sophisticated than a very good suit and a very convincing accent. Because sometimes the most effective place to hide is not in the shadows, but in the assumption of legitimacy. Story number 2. The Gentleman Who Borrowed Everything. In the lexicon of financial crime, the word confidence is not metaphorical. It is technical. A confidence scheme operates precisely and specifically on the mechanism of trust, on the willingness of a target to believe that the person in front of them is who they claim to be, doing what they claim to be doing for the reasons they claim to be doing it. Strip away the moral judgment, and what remains is an almost clinical study in the relationship between perceived legitimacy and actual power. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a man who operated under several names but was most commonly known in financial circles under a variant of the name John Garrison managed to penetrate the inner financial apparatus of at least one major European billionaire family through a method so elegant in its construction that the investigators who eventually unraveled it reportedly spent several silent minutes simply sitting with the documentation before saying anything at all. The family in question, we will call them the Hartenstein family for the purposes of this narrative, as their actual identity remains partially protected by ongoing civil proceedings in 3 jurisdictions, had built their fortune across 3 generations of industrial manufacturing in Central Europe. By the time the 3rd generation inherited the enterprise, it had diversified into real estate, private equity, and financial instruments of sufficient complexity that the family employed a small internal team of advisors, lawyers, and relationship managers whose sole function was to manage the relationships with external financial institutions on the family's behalf. It was precisely this layer, the layer of trusted intermediaries, that Garrison targeted. He did not approach the Hartenstein family. He approached their intermediaries. More specifically, He approached a mid-level relationship manager at one of the private banks that handled a portion of the family's European holdings, a man we will call Richter, a conscientious professional in his late 40s who had worked in private banking for 20 years and prided himself on his judgment. Garrison's opening was not a scheme, it was a referral. Genuine, verifiable, from a contact in Richter's professional network who had met Garrison at a conference in Geneva and found him impressive. This is the key detail that investigators would later circle in red. The initial referral was real. Garrison had spent months, possibly more than a year, cultivating the professional network necessary to generate a legitimate-seeming introduction to exactly the level of private banking at which he needed to operate. He was not improvising, he was engineering. The persona Garrison presented to Richter was that of a consultant specializing in alternative investment vehicles for ultra-high net worth European families, a niche but entirely credible specialty, particularly in the post-dot-com landscape where traditional asset allocation was under pressure and families like the Hartensteins were genuinely exploring instruments outside their historical comfort zone. His materials were impeccable. His references were, for the most part, real people who had genuinely interacted with him, and who, in most cases, had come away with a positive impression because the early stages of Garrison's relationships were always professionally flawless. Over a period of approximately 18 months, Garrison positioned himself as a resource for the Hartenstein family's private banking relationship, initially providing analysis, then recommendations, then, and this is where the architecture becomes breathtaking in its audacity, facilitating a series of transactions that routed funds through holding structures in jurisdictions where the Hartenstein family's direct oversight was limited. The amounts involved were significant, not the entirety of the family's holdings. Garrison was too sophisticated for that kind of grab, which would have triggered alarms immediately. What he extracted, through a layered series of fee structures, advisory retainers, and what appeared on paper to be legitimate investment placements, was a sum that investigators eventually placed at somewhere between 12 and 18 million euros, spread across a period long enough and structured with enough apparent legitimacy that the leakage was initially invisible against the background noise of a large and complex portfolio. The unraveling was not dramatic. It was the result of a routine internal audit, the kind that large family offices conduct periodically as a matter of governance hygiene, during which a newly hired compliance officer noticed that a series of advisory fee payments could not be traced back to any signed engagement letter in the Hartenstein family's records. Not missing. Simply never formally documented in the way that all such arrangements should have been. One thread pulled, then another, and then, very quickly, the whole construction became visible. What made investigators particularly uneasy was the quality of the documentation Garrison had produced. Not fraudulent in the obvious sense, not forged signatures or counterfeit letterheads. More sophisticated than that, real documents, legitimate entities, actual corporate structures that existed in real jurisdictions, all of it pointing toward investment activities that had genuinely occurred, but structured in such a way that the beneficial destination of the funds, after passing through several layers of the structure, was ultimately Garrison's. He had not stolen. He had invoiced. He had not forged. He had structured. The difference, in legal terms, was not as clean as the family would have liked. By the time the full picture was assembled and shared with law enforcement, Garrison had relocated. His trail was later picked up in Southeast Asia, then in South America. As of the last available reporting, which itself dates from several years ago, certain civil proceedings were ongoing, but criminal extradition remains complicated by jurisdictional questions that his apparent choice of residence had been specifically designed to raise. The Hartenstein family, through their lawyers, declined to characterize the total loss. What their compliance documents suggest, however, is that the number was large enough to be genuinely painful, and the lesson extracted from the experience was purchased at a cost that would have paid for many years of the enhanced governance procedures they subsequently implemented. The most chilling element of the Garrison story is not the theft, it is the duration. For 18 months, the man was inside the family's financial life, reading their documents, understanding their structures, sitting in meetings with their representatives, handling their money. For 18 months, he was the man they trusted. The vault, in this case, was not made of steel. It was made of assumptions, and Garrison had spent years learning exactly how to look like an assumption. There is a particular quality to the damage done by this kind of fraud that distinguishes it from simpler forms of theft. A burglary violates your physical space. It leaves traces, broken glass, disturbed surfaces, the unmistakable evidence of intrusion. You can catalog the loss, restore the space, install better locks, and draw a line between before and after. The psychological wound is real, but its boundaries are visible. The violation that Garrison inflicted on the Hartenstein family was of a different character. It was retroactive. Once the fraud was revealed, the family could not simply review what had been taken and move forward. They had to review every interaction, every meeting, every document, every transaction, going backward through 18 months of relationship with someone they had believed was working in their interest. They had to ask, about each moment of professional intimacy, was this genuine? Was this the performance of genuine advice? Was this genuine concern? Or was this the surface of a man who was simultaneously our advisor and our predator? The past became unknowable in a way it had not been before. This retroactive contamination of memory is, according to the professionals who counsel victims of serious financial fraud, one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of crimes of this kind. Not what was taken, but what is no longer certain. Not the empty account, but the relationship that now must be understood as having been, from its first moment, a fiction designed to reach that account. For people accustomed to trusting their own judgment, and wealthy families who have frequently succeeded in business through the quality of their judgment about people, tend to trust it considerably. The discovery that their judgment was not merely wrong, but was actively manipulated, represents a specific category of humiliation that goes well beyond financial loss. Garrison, as of the last reliable information available, had not been brought fully to justice in any jurisdiction. The civil proceedings offered partial remedies. The criminal dimensions of the case remained entangled in jurisdictional complexity. The money, or most of it, was in all likelihood gone, cycled through structures designed for exactly that purpose. The next chapter takes us in an entirely different direction, away from Europe's manicured private banking corridors and into the raw, visceral world of Silicon Valley in its first great surge of wealth creation, where a different kind of thief found a different kind of gap. Story number 3. The Ghost in the Server Room. Imagine the intoxicating atmosphere of Silicon Valley in the years between 1995 and 2001. The air itself seemed to vibrate at a different frequency. Men in their 20s were becoming paper millionaires at a rate that made traditional concepts of wealth accumulation feel like something from a sepia photograph. The social architecture of money was being rebuilt in real time, and in the spaces between the old structures and the new ones, in the gap between the institutional memory of how wealth was supposed to behave and the wild, ungoverned reality of how it was actually accumulating, there were opportunities that had never existed before. Gordon Rail never appeared on any Forbes list. He never gave a TED Talk. He was not a founder, not a VC, not even a particularly senior engineer at the company where he worked. He was, in the taxonomy of the technology industry, a system administrator, one of those essential, unglamorous figures who maintain the infrastructure on which the glamorous work happens. The people who keep the servers running. The people with root access. The company where Ryle worked, a networking equipment firm that had ridden the wave of internet infrastructure build-out to a market capitalization that would have been incomprehensible 5 years earlier, had as one of its largest individual shareholders a founder-turned-chairman whose personal stake in the company was valued, at the peak of the market, at somewhat over $3 billion. We will call this founder Marcus Held. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant engineer who had grown into a competent executive, a man who understood hardware architecture at a level that few people in the industry could match, and who understood the technology ecosystem he operated within with genuine sophistication. What he did not understand, what almost no one of his generation and position fully understood in that era, was the degree to which the digital infrastructure of his personal financial life had become an attack surface. Rael's position as a system administrator gave him access to the company's internal systems. This was legitimate and necessary for his work. But what he had spent time quietly mapping, in the hours when his legitimate responsibilities did not require his full attention, was the degree to which the company's internal systems overlapped with the personal digital lives of its senior executives. Email accounts, internal file systems, the accumulated metadata of a working life conducted largely through digital communication. What he found, with patient attention, was that Helt, like many executives of his era, had used his company email infrastructure for personal correspondence in ways that created a detailed map of his personal financial architecture. Not intentionally, not carelessly exactly, simply in the way that busy people use the tools available to them without fully modeling the security implications of that use. There were communications with personal bankers. There were references to account structures. There were, crucially, password reset flows for personal financial accounts that referenced email addresses hosted on infrastructure that Rael administered. This last detail is the one that should make every reader pause and consider their own digital hygiene. The company email system was secured, but Rael had administrative access to that system, and several of Helt's personal financial accounts, brokerage accounts holding portions of his company stock, personal investment accounts accumulated over years of pre-IPO equity, used his company email address as the recovery address for authentication. Rael did not hack anything in the Hollywood sense. He did not break encryption or defeat firewall systems. He used his legitimate administrative access to intercept a password reset email, use the reset to access a brokerage account, and then, and this is where the scheme becomes genuinely sophisticated, initiate a series of transactions designed to look, in their early stages, like the kind of portfolio rebalancing that a wealthy executive might conduct routinely. The amounts he moved were not small. In total, across a period of approximately 4 months, he redirected somewhere in the range of $2 to $3 million into accounts that, through several layers of intermediate structure, eventually resolved to his control. $2 to $3 million sounds, in the context of a $3 billion fortune, almost trivial. It was not trivial. It was the precise calibration of a man who understood that greed, in this context, was his greatest enemy. He was not trying to take everything. He was trying to take enough to matter, while staying below the threshold that would trigger the kind of immediate, aggressive response that a catastrophic theft would generate. The investigation that eventually caught him is a study in the unexpected. It was not a cybersecurity audit that flagged the anomaly. It was a tax accountant. Helt's personal financial advisor, conducting a routine review of the previous year's account activity in preparation for tax filings, noticed discrepancies in transaction records that did not match any instruction he had received. He brought it to Helt. Helt, who had the instincts of an engineer even when confronting personal crisis, immediately recognized that the pattern of the unauthorized transactions, the timing, the amounts, the specific accounts affected, suggested someone with knowledge of his financial structure that went beyond any external attacker. Someone who had been watching from inside. The subsequent investigation, conducted with the involvement of federal authorities, eventually led to Rael. His conviction and sentencing were reported briefly in the local Bay Area press, and then largely forgotten. One of dozens of computer fraud cases that moved through the courts in that era, most of them insufficiently dramatic to hold the attention of journalists working against a background of constant, deafening news about the technology industry. What the case represented, however, in the quiet conversation of information security professionals, was a landmark. Not because of its technical sophistication, it was, in purely technical terms, relatively simple, but because it illustrated with crystalline clarity the threat that the security industry would spend the next 2 decades slowly learning to articulate. The insider who does not need to break in because they are already in. The trusted administrator whose access is indistinguishable from legitimate use until the moment it isn't. The human being who sits at the intersection of institutional trust and personal desperation and finds, in that intersection, a door. The next chapter leaves the digital world entirely and takes us back to something older, more physical, more cinematic. A theft conducted against a man who had built his fortune in the physical world and believed, perhaps understandably, that the physical world's rules would protect him. Story number 4. The art that walked out the front door. There is a particular type of collector that money produces, distinct from the type that passion produces, though the two sometimes overlap. The passion collector acquires because they love. The wealth collector acquires because collection is what wealth does with itself when it has satisfied every other desire. By the late 1990s, Viktor Vekselberg, the Russian aluminum and oil magnate whose fortune had been carved from the wreckage of Soviet industry with the particular ferocity that characterized the oligarchs of the first post-Soviet decade, had become both kinds of collector simultaneously. He is perhaps best known internationally for his acquisition in 2004 of the Forbes family's collection of 9 Imperial Fabergé eggs for a sum reported at approximately $100 million, the largest single purchase of Fabergé objects in history. The purchase was, by design, a statement. It was a Russian billionaire returning Russian cultural treasures to Russian hands, and Vekselberg made no secret of the nationalistic and personal dimensions of the acquisition. But before the famous eggs, before the international headlines, there was a different collection, more intimate, less formally guarded, maintained not in a dedicated facility with museum-grade security, but in the revolving, distributed manner that characterized the domestic arrangements of many Russian businessmen of that era, when money was being accumulated faster than the infrastructure to protect it could be built. The story of what disappeared from the periphery of Vekselberg's holdings during the late 1990s and early 2000s is complicated by the specific opacity that surrounded Russian business of that period. Documentation was inconsistent. Provenance was sometimes deliberately unclear. The relationship between private collection and corporate asset was frequently ambiguous. And the men who were in a position to understand the full picture, the lawyers, accountants, and fixers who operated in the space between Vekselberg's various enterprises, had their own reasons, in many cases, for not making that picture fully visible. What we know, from a combination of court records in multiple jurisdictions, investigative reporting by journalists covering Russian capital flows in that era, and the eventual surfacing of specific objects in the European art market, is this. Over a period of several years in the late 1990s, a significant number of items from collections associated with Vekselberg's holdings, decorative arts, historical Russian silverware, pre-revolutionary religious objects, were removed from the custody of those holdings and began moving through the European and American markets. The mechanism was, in retrospect, almost breathtakingly simple. The objects were not stolen by breaking into secured facilities. They were removed by the people responsible for managing them, employees, agents, intermediaries, who were operating in an environment where accountability structures were insufficiently robust to catch the leakage before it became significant. In the specific chaos of Russian capitalism in the 90s, where legal structures were being invented and reinvented continuously, where the relationship between private property and state interest was genuinely unclear, and where the men managing the vast, sprawling portfolios of the oligarchs often had more autonomy than their principals fully understood, the conditions for this kind of systematic removal were almost endemic. It was not a single dramatic heist. It was a slow drain, conducted not by outsiders, but by the trusted network of people who made the collection visible, transportable, and therefore vulnerable. When specific objects began appearing in Western auction houses and galleries with provenance documentation that was sufficiently vague to pass initial scrutiny, but insufficiently robust to withstand serious examination, the process of unraveling began. Scholars noticed. Dealers who had prior knowledge of the object's Russian origins made calls. The documentation trail, followed backward, led to a network of intermediaries whose role in the removal of the objects gradually became visible. Legal proceedings followed in multiple jurisdictions. Some objects were recovered, others were not. The financial value of what was definitively established as having been removed was, in the terms of such proceedings, substantial, though the opacity of the original documentation made establishing the full scope both legally and practically difficult. The deeper story here is one about the structural vulnerability that comes with a particular kind of rapid wealth accumulation, when the collection of assets outruns the development of systems designed to protect and account for those assets. Vexelberg, like many of his contemporaries, had built his fortune at a velocity that made comprehensive institutional governance essentially impossible to maintain at every level simultaneously. In the gaps between the oversight, in the spaces between the principals and the people who managed the physical reality of the holdings, there was room for removal. The objects that disappeared from the margins of this collection were not abstractions. They were physical things, handmade, historically significant, carrying the weight of Russian cultural history in their metal and enamel and glass. Some of them are now, if the art market's quiet consensus is to be believed, in private collections in Europe and North America, whose owners may or may not be fully aware of the circumstances that brought the objects to market. They sit in rooms illuminated by careful lighting, admired by people who did not steal them, carrying their history silently. From Russia's chaotic first decade of private wealth, we travel westward, to Britain, to a world of old money and older institutions, where a very different kind of theft took advantage of very different kinds of assumptions. Story number 5. The Heir Who Never Was. Old money operates on a particular logic. It is not the logic of acquisition. That phase, in most cases, is several generations in the past, but the logic of preservation. The institutions that surround inherited wealth in Britain are, at their best, extraordinarily sophisticated mechanisms for the protection of capital across time. Family trusts, entailed estates, charitable foundations, private banks whose client relationships span generations, all of it designed to ensure that what was accumulated by the grandfather does not simply dissolve in the hands of the grandchildren. The family at the center of this story, a family whose fortune derived from 19th century industrial investment and whose wealth had been carefully preserved through 2 world wars, a depression, and the gradual transformation of British economic life, had maintained their capital across 5 generations with the kind of disciplined institutional oversight that estate lawyers hold up as a model. Their trustees were experienced. Their documentation was meticulous. Their legal structures have been reviewed and updated regularly across decades. None of this prevented what happened between 1997 and 2003. It is necessary here to introduce the concept of inheritance fraud in its most sophisticated form, not the crude variety that involves forged wills and obvious deception, but the kind that operates at the level of identity itself. The kind that asks, how well does a wealthy family actually know the people to whom it believes itself to be connected? The man who entered the orbit of this family, we will refer to him as Thomas Farley, which is not his name, did so through the specific social geography of Britain's charitable sector. He identified himself as a distant relative, a genealogical connection 2 generations removed that was sufficiently credible to be difficult to disprove without serious investment of time and legal resources. He had done his research. He knew which branches of the family tree were sparsely documented. He knew which relatives had emigrated, died young, or otherwise left gaps in the family's self-knowledge. He positioned himself in one of those gaps. The initial contact was not financial, it was social, and this is the critical distinction. Farley did not immediately present himself as someone with a claim on the family's resources. He presented himself as someone with an interest in family history, a connection to shared roots, a warmth and recognition that spoke to the specific emotional needs of people navigating the complex emotional landscape of inherited wealth and identity. He was welcomed, gradually, into the family's social world. He was present at events. He was introduced to trustees, to family solicitors, to the network of professional advisors whose role was to manage the family's affairs. Over a period of years, he constructed, through sheer social proximity, a presence that began to feel, to the people around him, like legitimacy. What he was doing, while constructing this social presence, was mapping. He was learning the structure of the family's holdings with the patient attention of someone who intends to act eventually, but has no need to act yet. He was identifying the specific instruments, the trusts, the investment accounts, the charitable structures, where action would eventually be possible. And he was identifying the specific vulnerabilities in the documentation trails that would make that action difficult to reverse quickly once it was initiated. The financial actions, when they came, were conducted through the family's own legal and financial infrastructure, not by impersonating family members in the crude sense, not through forged signatures on documents that would be immediately scrutinized. Rather, by using his established social presence to engage in transactions that, at the level of the individual advisor or trustee handling them, appeared to be the kind of family business that legitimately connected individuals could conduct. He was by this point trusted. He was by this point known. The total amount extracted through this method across the full period of the scheme's operation was eventually established at somewhere between £800,000 and £1.2 million, a figure that, while not catastrophic in the context of the family's total holdings, was deeply significant in the context of the violation it represented. The money was, in some sense, the lesser part of the injury. The greater injury was the social one. Because Farley had been present in the family's life for years, he had attended family occasions, he had sat at tables where matters of genuine intimacy were discussed. He had been trusted with the specific, complex, emotional reality of a wealthy family navigating inheritance, identity, and the weight of accumulated history. He had been, in every meaningful social sense, part of the family, and the discovery that this was never true, that it had all been constructed, was a violation of a depth that no financial restitution could fully address. He was eventually identified and prosecuted. His actual identity, when established, turned out to be that of a man with a sophisticated prior history of similar approaches, less elaborate, less successful, in other social contexts. He was, in the vocabulary of con artistry, a professional. The family had been, in the hardest sense, one of many. The lesson that the family's trustees took from the experience and spent considerable money afterward implementing was about the limits of social knowledge as a substitute for documentary verification. We know people, we feel we know people, and in most cases that social knowledge is sufficient. But sophisticated operators can construct the social reality of knowing from the outside, using research and patience and the fundamental human desire to recognize kinship. The fortress, in this case, was not made of stone, it was made of the assumption that the family knew who its family was. The story that follows is about a different kind of assumption. The assumption that institutions as old and as well fortified as central banks are immune to the particular vulnerabilities that afflict smaller organizations. This assumption, it turns out, is as fragile as any other. Story number 6. The bankers who forgot about weekends. When Sheikh Hasina's government announced in February of 2016 that the Central Bank of Bangladesh had been robbed of $81 million through a series of fraudulent transfers routed through the SWIFT interbank messaging system, the financial world experienced a specific kind of vertigo. It was not simply the amount, though $81 million is a genuinely staggering sum for any institution to lose in a single operation. It was the method. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is not, in common understanding, the kind of thing that gets robbed. It is the plumbing of global finance. It is the system through which central banks and financial institutions communicate with each other, conducting the transfers that constitute the actual movement of money at the international level. The idea that SWIFT could be penetrated and used as the instrument of a theft felt, to many observers, like being told that someone had figured out how to rob a bank by mailing a very convincing letter to another bank. The Bangladesh bank case is, depending on how you frame it, either the most sophisticated bank robbery in history, or a crime whose sophistication was less about technical genius and more about the exploitation of institutional assumptions so fundamental that no one had thought to question them. Begin with the target. Bangladesh Bank, the nation's central bank, holds accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a standard arrangement for central banks maintaining foreign currency reserves. Those reserves, at the time of the attack, included a sum of approximately $1 billion in dollar-denominated assets. The institution was not, in international terms, particularly well-resourced from a cybersecurity standpoint. Its systems were not cutting-edge. The computers used to interface with the SWIFT network were, by some reports, connected to the broader bank network in ways that would have made any competent security auditor uncomfortable. The attackers, later attributed by multiple intelligence agencies and independent researchers to a group with connections to North Korea, though the full attribution remains contested in some particulars, had spent months inside Bangladesh Bank systems before they moved. This is the detail that never fully made it into the popular retelling of the story. The robbery did not begin with the fraudulent SWIFT messages. It began with an initial compromise of Bangladesh Bank's network that preceded the actual theft by a period that investigators estimated at somewhere between 1 and 2 years. For that period, the attackers were present, learning, observing, understanding the rhythms of the institution, mapping the specific technical and procedural details of how the SWIFT interface was operated. What they eventually understood was this: the transactions they planned to initiate would move money from Bangladesh Bank's account at the Federal Reserve in New York to accounts at a bank in the Philippines. The New York Federal Reserve operates on Eastern Time. The Bangladesh Bank operates on Bangladesh Standard Time, which is approximately 11 hours ahead. And the Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation in Manila, where the destination accounts had been opened with fraudulent documentation, operates on Philippine Standard Time. The timing of the fraudulent transfers was not accidental. They were initiated to coincide with a Bangladesh Bank weekend, when no one at the institution was monitoring incoming SWIFT messages, and were designed to complete their movement through the New York Federal Reserve before the beginning of the American business day, routing into accounts in Manila that would be accessible before Philippine banking authorities could be alerted and act. The first batch of transfers, totaling approximately $1 billion in requests, was submitted to the New York Federal Reserve's SWIFT interface in the name of Bangladesh Bank. A sophisticated filtering system at the Fed flagged several of the transactions for review due to inconsistencies in the beneficiary information. Some were held. Some were released. The $35 million released before the flags triggered completed their journey to Manila. Another $46 million was in transit to a separate set of accounts. A total of $81 million left the Federal Reserve's custody before the fraud was definitively identified and the remaining transactions were halted. In Manila, the money moved fast. It was distributed across multiple accounts and, within days, converted to physical chips at a casino, where electronic transaction monitoring does not apply in the same way it does to bank transfers. The physical chips were cashed out and distributed through a network of individuals and entities that subsequent investigations have been able to trace only partially. The remaining nearly $950 million in transfer requests, the bulk of what the attackers had attempted, was saved by a detail almost too mundane to believe: a spelling error. One of the transfer requests contained a misspelling of "foundation" instead of "foundation" in a beneficiary field. This triggered an additional review flag at Deutsche Bank, through which one of the routing paths passed, which in turn led to the entire remaining queue being scrutinized and held. The difference between a catastrophic loss of approximately $1 billion and a merely devastating loss of $81 million was a single misspelled word. The Bangladesh Bank attack was not, in its basic mechanics, a theft from a billionaire. It was a theft from an institution. But the connection to our broader story is this: the reserve funds held at the New York Federal Reserve belonged, in a meaningful sense, to the people of Bangladesh, to a nation whose institutions had accumulated foreign exchange reserves through collective economic effort. And the individuals who bore the closest responsibility for the vulnerability that was exploited, the senior officials whose decisions about cybersecurity investment and SWIFT interface management had created the conditions for the attack, included figures of personal wealth and institutional power that placed them in a category adjacent to the individuals at the center of our other narratives. The case also illustrates something that many of the stories in this anthology share. The vulnerability was not hidden. It was in plain sight, in the known architecture of the institution, in the decisions that have been made about what to invest in and what to defer. The attackers did not find a secret door. They found a door that had simply never been properly locked because no one had fully believed that anyone would try it. The next chapter introduces a man who understood the physical architecture of wealth in a way that no one around him did, and used that understanding to conduct one of the most intimate and psychologically unsettling thefts in this entire collection. Story number 7. The Contractor Who Stayed After Hours. There is a specific class of wealthy individual whose security is, by necessity, theatrical rather than functional. The truly ultra-wealthy, the individuals whose protection is managed by former intelligence professionals operating dedicated security operations, achieve a level of real security that is essentially impenetrable to casual threat. But the stratum just below that level, the mere billionaires and centimillionaires whose security consists of alarm systems, safe rooms, and carefully selected service contractors, occupies a different position. Their security is designed to deter the opportunist. It has less to say to the determined professional. Gilles Vanier, and this name, unlike some others in this collection, is real, was a contractor, not in the financial sense, in the literal, physical sense, a skilled craftsman who specialized in high-end residential construction and renovation in the south of France, a region where the density of extraordinary private wealth per square kilometer is among the highest in the world. Between the Côte d'Azur and the hill towns of Provence, Vanier and his small company had, over the course of nearly 2 decades, become a trusted name among a specific clientele. The owners of the kind of properties where renovation work is not a matter of replacing kitchen cabinets, but of managing multi-year projects involving specialized materials, historical preservation requirements, and price tags with many zeros. His clients trusted him. This was not incidental to his business model. It was the business model. In the world of high-end residential construction, where a single project might involve years of access to a private home, its rooms, its habits, its vulnerabilities, trust is the currency that determines which contractors get the calls. Vanier had built his reputation on discretion, quality, and the specific kind of professional reliability that wealthy clients prize above all other qualities in the people who work inside their homes. What he had also built, over those same years, was a comprehensive mental map of the properties he had worked on. Not maliciously, at first, or perhaps not exclusively. He was, by professional necessity, observant. A good contractor notices everything about a property, its structural logic, its circulation patterns, the relationship between its visible surfaces and the infrastructure behind them, where walls are hollow, where the thickness of construction suggests the presence of something meant to be protected, where the service entrances and the connections to utility infrastructure create pathways that bypass the formal entry points and their associated security systems. He had, in other words, an education in the physical security of some of the most expensive private residences in Europe that was more intimate and comprehensive than any security consultant's report. He understood these houses from the inside out, literally. The theft, or rather, the series of thefts, because it was not a single event, involved properties belonging to at least 3 individuals of significant wealth, including one family whose net worth placed them comfortably in the billionaire tier. The method was consistent across cases. Vanier used his knowledge of the property's physical infrastructure to access them through pathways that the alarm systems and security cameras were not configured to monitor. Not service entrances exactly, something more specific than that. Points of vulnerability that existed precisely because his renovation work had created them, or because his years of working in the properties had revealed them to his particular kind of attention. He targeted specific categories of items, cash that the wealthy keep in the informal, semi-liquid form that very rich people sometimes maintain for convenience, small items of extraordinary value, jewelry, watches, specific pieces whose portability and market liquidity made them ideal targets, and, in at least one case, documentation whose existence he had learned about during renovation work, and whose value was less in the object itself than in what it represented. The investigation that eventually connected the thefts to Vanier was slow in coming, precisely because the entry methods he used left no obvious forensic trace. There was no broken glass, no forced lock. The items were simply absent. The security systems showed nothing. The question of how access had been gained seemed, in the early stages of each investigation, genuinely mysterious. And mystery, in wealthy families with complex social lives and multiple staff members, tends to diffuse rather than focus suspicion. What eventually linked the cases, and this is both the mechanical and the deeply human detail at the heart of the story, was the name of a single contractor who appeared in the records of all 3 affected properties. Not because investigators were looking for such a pattern, because a detective in Marseille, conducting a routine audit of possible connections between 2 of the cases, noticed the name in a property record search and, with the instinct of a good investigator, simply asked the question, "Who else has worked in these houses?" The answer, when documented, told the story before any interview was conducted. Vanier was convicted. His sentence was significant. And in the aftermath of his prosecution, the security industry that serves ultra-high net worth individuals in the south of France underwent a quiet rethinking of a question that had somehow never been fully formalized. What procedures govern the physical security review of properties after significant renovation work? What is the protocol for the period between the end of a contractor's access and the reconfiguration of the security systems to account for whatever that contractor might have learned? The answer, before Vanier, was essentially nothing. There was no protocol because there had been no perceived need for one. The contractor was trusted. The renovation was done. The house was closed. What could possibly be the problem? The next story crosses the Atlantic to the United States and to a world of technology wealth that had, by the mid-2000s, entered a phase of self-confidence that was particularly difficult to penetrate, except, as it turned out, in one very specific way. Story number 8. The identity that traveled faster than its owner. Larry Ellison's reputation for combativeness was, by the early 2000s, almost as famous as his company. He had built Oracle into one of the most powerful enterprise software companies on Earth through a combination of technical brilliance, ruthless competitive instinct, and a personal style that made even his admirers describe him in terms that were simultaneously admiring and slightly afraid. He sailed racing yachts in competitions that occasionally seemed designed to demonstrate that the ocean itself was insufficiently challenging. He built a Japanese imperial palace in the hills of Woodside, California, a property of extraordinary beauty and a price tag that was a matter of public record. He was, in the vocabulary of technology culture, a force of nature. And yet, in 2002, a man who had never met him managed to represent himself as connected to his household, to a financial services provider, and in doing so, extracted services and access worth a sum that, while not catastrophic to someone of Ellison's resources, was meaningful in itself, and profoundly significant in what it illustrated about the specific vulnerability of individuals whose identities have become, through their own celebrity and success, matters of extensive public record. The mechanism, in its essentials, was social engineering of a specific and increasingly common type, the exploitation of a target's publicly known identity to construct a fictional relationship of authority or proximity that an institutional service provider has insufficient means to verify. The individual in question, documented in court filings under the case number that we will not reproduce here for reasons of complexity, had assembled from entirely public sources a detailed portrait of the organizational and personal apparatus around Ellison. The names of assistants, the characteristics of the household's various needs, the general shape of the logistics that supporting a billionaire's life requires. This is, in the age of the internet, not difficult. The machinery of supporting an individual of that prominence generates enormous amounts of publicly accessible exhaust: vendor relationships, charitable filings, real estate records, company registrations, journalism about household staff, profiles of the various business relationships that constitute a billionaire's daily operational reality. Armed with this portrait, the individual approached service providers, in specific, a set of businesses that provided luxury goods, private aviation services, and hospitality arrangements, representing himself as an authorized representative of Ellison's household operations. He was not impersonating Ellison. He was impersonating the category of person, the authorized fixer, the household logistics coordinator, who exists around individuals of that level of resource. He understood that these service providers receive instructions from such intermediaries routinely, that their verification processes are optimized for speed and convenience rather than rigorous identity validation, and that the specific knowledge he had assembled made his impersonation credible at the level of detail required to pass initial scrutiny. The value of what he obtained: private aviation arrangements, luxury hotel accommodations, a range of high-end services rendered on the understanding that they would be billed to accounts associated with Ellison's household, was, by the accounting established in subsequent legal proceedings, somewhere in the range of several $100,000. Again, not catastrophic in the abstract. Deeply revealing in the specific. The arrest came through a combination of a service provider that decided to verify directly with the household before processing a particularly large arrangement, and the subsequent tracing of communication patterns that eventually identified the individual responsible. The legal proceedings that followed established the basic facts of the case in court documentation that has been available to researchers since. What the Ellison case illustrates, and what makes it relevant to this anthology despite its relative modesty compared to some of the other stories, is something about the specific vulnerability that extreme public prominence creates. Ellison was, in some sense, robbed by his own celebrity. The detailed public knowledge of his life, his household, his organizational apparatus, made it possible for someone who had never set foot near him to construct a sufficiently convincing fiction of proximity and authority to deceive institutional service providers. The lesson is uncomfortable because it is essentially unanswerable. You cannot unpublish a biography. You cannot erase the public record of a life conducted in the spotlight. You can make your institutional verification processes more rigorous, but rigorous processes create friction, and friction is the enemy of the speed that makes wealthy people's lives function. There is a genuine tension here between security and convenience that cannot be resolved without choosing which you value more, and most wealthy people, most of the time, choose convenience until the moment they cannot. We are approaching the final chapters of this anthology, and the stories that remain are perhaps the most unsettling, because they involved thefts that operated not on the margins of their targets' worlds, but at the center, in the boardrooms and financial structures that the most powerful people in the world believed were the most secure environments they occupied. Story number 9. The Algorithm That Learned to Steal. Sergei Mavrodi, the founder of the financial pyramid that devastated millions of Russians in the 1990s, was himself robbed in a manner so philosophically appropriate that if you encountered it in a novel, you would dismiss it as too neat. But Mavrodi is not, in the strict sense, the billionaire at the center of this chapter. He is the framework. The actual figure at the center belongs to the overlapping world of post-Soviet financial engineering and early algorithmic trading, a world populated by extraordinarily intelligent people who believed they had found, in the mathematics of financial markets, a system that was effectively immune to the old-fashioned vulnerabilities of human trust and human error. The individual we will call Dmitry Kurnov had made his fortune in the decade between approximately 1998 and 2008 through a combination of genuine mathematical talent, extraordinary risk tolerance, and a capacity for the specific kind of institutional arbitrage that the incomplete development of Russian financial markets made available to those who understood both the mathematics and the regulatory landscape simultaneously. By the late 2000s, his personal wealth was estimated by people in a position to estimate such things at somewhere north of $2 billion. He was also, by this point, a sophisticated user of algorithmic trading strategies, systems that operated according to pre-programmed rules, executing trades at speeds and in patterns that human traders could not match, extracting value from market microstructure in ways that required no human decision in the moment of execution. The development and protection of these algorithms was, for Kurnov, a matter of the highest priority. They represented, in a very direct sense, the intellectual core of his wealth generation capacity. What he did not fully understand, or perhaps understood and underestimated, was the degree to which the development of these algorithms required him to work with a small team of extraordinarily talented mathematicians and engineers, whose access to the algorithmic systems was, by necessity, complete. You cannot have a team build and maintain a complex automated trading system while keeping them ignorant of how it works. The knowledge is the thing. And the knowledge was, ultimately, portable. The individual who acted on this portability, a mathematician we will call only by the initial V, for reasons that remain legally complicated, had worked with Kurnov's operation for approximately 4 years. During this period, he had contributed significantly to the development of certain proprietary trading approaches. He had also, with the patient clarity of someone who intends eventually to leave, constructed a complete understanding of the algorithmic architecture sufficient to recreate its essential elements elsewhere. When V left the organization, following a dispute over compensation that, by his account, was a matter of principle and, by Kurnov's account, was a matter of ingratitude, he did so with documentation. Not physical theft of code in the obvious sense, though the legal proceedings that eventually followed included allegations along those lines. More precisely, he left with knowledge that was sufficiently detailed to enable him to construct, in collaboration with new partners, a set of trading strategies that were, in their essential mathematical logic, derived from the proprietary work developed for Kurnov. These strategies were then deployed in markets that overlapped, in timing and instrument, with Kurnov's own algorithmic operations, and the effect was, in certain measurable periods, to erode the edge that Kurnov's systems had been generating. Not through direct interference, not through anything that could be pointed to as a discrete criminal act. Through the simple fact of competition from strategies that shared the same intellectual DNA and therefore exploited the same market inefficiencies, saturating them and reducing their value to both parties. The financial harm to Kurnov was real and material. The legal path to addressing it was extraordinarily complicated, touching on questions about the ownership of mathematical ideas, the boundaries of trade secret protection in financial algorithms, and the specific evidentiary challenges of proving, in a court of law, that two distinct bodies of algorithmic logic share a common origin. The proceedings stretched across years and jurisdictions. The outcomes were mixed, and the fundamental question raised by the case remains, in the view of legal scholars who have written about it, when the most valuable thing a company has is a set of mathematical ideas that live in human minds, what does theft actually mean, and how is it addressed? To appreciate the full weight of this question, consider the specific nature of what V had taken. A painting is a physical object. A collection of scrolls is tangible. Money in an account has a discrete existence at a specific moment in time. But an algorithmic trading strategy is none of these things. It is a set of rules, expressed in mathematics, about how to respond to the behavior of financial markets under specific conditions. It lives in code, yes, but the code is merely the crystallization of a set of ideas, and ideas cannot be carried in a bag or tracked by a serial number. When V sat down with his new partners and began reconstructing the essential logic of the strategies he had helped develop for Kurnov, he was not physically removing anything from Kurnov's possession. Kurnov still had his algorithms. His system still ran. His models still executed. What V was doing was creating a parallel existence, a competing version of the same intellectual architecture, one that would operate in the same markets, at the same times, hunting the same inefficiencies, and in doing so, gradually crowding out the edge on which Kurnov's returns depended. This is the specific financial mechanism that makes algorithmic theft so insidious. You do not need to steal the object to steal its value. You need only to reproduce its essence in sufficient detail to compete with it. And competition of this kind, in the specific microstructure of quantitative financial markets, is not a gradual, gentle pressure. It is a direct, mathematically precise erosion. When two strategies that share the same essential logic compete in the same instruments and time windows, they do not each earn half of what one would earn alone. They saturate the opportunity, eliminate the edge, and both earn significantly less than one would have earned in the absence of the other. Kurnov watched, in the months and years after V's departure, as certain of his strategy's performance metrics degraded in ways that were difficult to explain through market evolution alone. The patterns were too specific, the degradation too targeted, the timing too coincident with the appearance in certain markets of execution patterns that bore the unmistakable signature of logic he recognized. He could not prove it in a courtroom. That is the final, deepest cruelty of this kind of theft. The victim can feel the harm, can measure it, in some cases, with mathematical precision, can recognize in the behavior of a competitor the echo of their own intellectual work. But the evidentiary standard required to translate this recognition into a legally actionable claim, to prove that the specific mathematical structure of a competitor's strategy is derived from a specific prior work, when both parties dispute not the similarity but the origination, is extraordinarily high. Higher, in most cases, than the available evidence can meet. The case serves as a warning that has still not been fully absorbed by the culture of quantitative finance. Intellectual property, in the age of algorithmic trading, is among the most valuable and most vulnerable assets that a financial operation can possess, more vulnerable in many cases than the money itself, because money can be locked in vaults and tracked across ledgers. But the ideas that generate the money live in human minds, and human minds, however contractually bound, cannot be audited at the door. From the conceptual edge of algorithmic theft, the final chapter of this anthology brings us back to something older, slower, and in many ways more emotionally devastating. A theft conducted not against a company or a portfolio, but against a family, using the one instrument that no amount of wealth can fully protect against: time. Story number 10. The Nurse Who Remembered Everything. In the hierarchy of human vulnerability, there is perhaps no state more complex than the vulnerability of extreme old age in the context of extreme wealth. The physical decline of cognitive capacity, the specific loneliness of outliving the peers who could serve as witnesses to one's earlier self, the increasing dependence on people whose motives can never be fully known, these create conditions of exposure that no legal structure, however sophisticated, was designed to address comprehensively. The story of Huguette Clark, the reclusive copper heiress who spent the last decades of her long life, she died in 2011 at the age of 104, in a series of hospital rooms she preferred to her various extraordinary properties, is in some ways the most gentle and in some ways the most disturbing in this entire anthology. Because it did not involve violence or hacking or elaborate fraud, it involved presence, the simple, unrelenting power of presence. Clark was the daughter of William Andrews Clark, the copper magnate and senator whose fortune, accumulated through Montana copper mines in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, had been among the largest in the United States at its peak. By the time Huguette Clark reached her final decades, the fortune had been significantly reduced from its original scale, but remained, by any ordinary measure, extraordinary. Multiple historic properties including a Connecticut estate, a California property, and a 5-room apartment on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, a collection of Japanese dolls and miniature houses of scholarly significance, a collection of paintings including several Renoirs, and a range of financial assets whose total value, when her estate was finally assembled, was estimated at approximately $300 million. She had spent the last 2 decades of her life in hospitals, not because she was desperately ill, at least not in her earlier years of hospital residence. Her health was fragile but did not require the level of care that hospitals typically provide to residents. She simply preferred it. The structure, the routine, the particular quality of attention that hospital care provides. She had largely withdrawn from the social world decades earlier, communicating with a small circle through letters and telephone calls, never receiving visitors in person. What must be understood about Huguette Clark's withdrawal from the world is that it was not a symptom of dysfunction. It was a preference, the deeply personal, entirely rational preference of a woman who had grown up watching the machinery of inherited wealth and social obligation consume the people around her, and who had decided, at some point in her middle years, that she did not want to be consumed by it. She paid full rent on her Fifth Avenue apartment for decades while never setting foot in it. She paid the salaries of a full staff for her Connecticut estate, Bellows Guardo, for decades while the estate remained largely unoccupied. She made deliberate choices to maintain the physical infrastructure of her life without inhabiting it, because the infrastructure itself was not the point. What she was protecting was her time, her attention, her particular quiet inner life of dolls and watercolors and Japanese aesthetics, and the specific contemplative joy she took in miniature things, in the exquisite, handcrafted detail of objects small enough to be fully comprehended, controlled, and known. She was, in other words, a woman who understood the dangers of scale, who had reduced her world by choice to dimensions she could master, and who, in doing so, had created a paradox. A woman of extraordinary assets, living in a world of extraordinary smallness, protected in her daily life only by the small number of people she had allowed past the perimeter she had constructed. This is the condition that the people around her eventually had to decide what to do with. The cast of individuals who occupied the role of trusted intimates in the final decades of Clark's life was small, and over time became smaller. Among the most significant of these was her private nurse, Hadassah Perry, who had been caring for her since the 1970s. Perry was, by all accounts, genuinely devoted to Clark. The relationship between them was by every indication real, warm, and important to both women. Clark was extraordinarily generous to Perry during her lifetime, gifts totaling, according to the legal proceedings that followed Clark's death, approximately $31 million over the course of their relationship. Also occupying a position of considerable trust and influence in Clark's later years was her attorney, Wallace Bach, who had served as her legal advisor for decades and, as her social world contracted, had come to serve as one of the primary points of contact between Clark and the institutional world that her wealth required her to navigate. After Clark's death, her estate became the subject of one of the most legally complex probate proceedings in American history. The dispute involved competing claims to her fortune from distant relatives she had never met, from charitable organizations, and from the individuals, Perry, Bach, and several others, who had received what the estate's administrators characterized as extraordinarily large gifts and bequests, whose validity was questioned on grounds that included Clark's mental capacity to make them, and the degree of undue influence that had been exercised by those in positions of trust. The legal proceedings eventually resulted in a settlement, in which Perry agreed to return approximately $5 million to the estate, and Bach agreed to pay back a sum in the hundreds of thousands. Neither admitted wrongdoing. The settlement was framed as a resolution of disputed claims, rather than an acknowledgement of the theft that some of Clark's distant relatives and estate advocates had alleged in their filings. What the case illuminated, and what makes it a fitting final chapter for this anthology, is the deepest and most philosophically troubling category of theft from the very wealthy, the kind that operates through the mechanism of genuine relationship, the kind where the person in a position of influence may themselves not know precisely where devoted care ends and exploitation begins, where generosity and manipulation are not easily distinguishable from the inside or the outside, where the law can identify patterns that concern it, but cannot easily separate the authentic from the constructed. Huguette Clark spent more than 2 decades in hospitals, watching puppet shows on television, tending to her collection of Japanese dolls, speaking on the telephone to a small number of people she trusted. The world in which she had grown up, the world of her father's industrial America, of Fifth Avenue apartments and Connecticut estates, of a kind of inherited wealth that carried with it an entire social architecture, had long since dissolved around her. What remained was a woman of extreme age and extraordinary resources, dependent for her daily reality on people whose motives she could not fully assess, and whose affection she could not afford to doubt. The theft, if we agree to use that word, with all its acknowledged complexity in this context, was conducted not by strangers, not by hackers, not by confidence men. It was conducted by the closest people, in the quietest possible way, over the longest possible time. There was no single moment of crime. There was instead a gradual reshaping of the boundaries of what was given and what was taken, in a context where Clark herself may have sanctioned the giving without fully understanding the taking. In the end, approximately $130 million of Clark's $300 million estate was the subject of legal dispute regarding the circumstances of its distribution. Roughly 40% of her life's accumulated wealth, contested on grounds that spoke directly to the vulnerabilities of extreme age, extreme isolation, and extreme trust. Epilogue: What the Vaults Don't Tell You. 10 stories, 10 fortresses, 10 cracks. Stand back from the individual dramas and what emerges is a pattern, not of criminal technique exactly, but of human architecture. Every one of the thefts in this anthology exploited something that the target had treated as a strength. The insider knowledge was possible because the household was trusted enough to be known from the inside. The financial fraud worked because the family had delegated enough to be genuinely ignorant of what was happening in their own name. The digital theft succeeded because the executive had used his institutional access for personal convenience, creating a surface that his own system administrator could reach. The art walked out because the collection was too large to be fully known. The identity imposture worked because the celebrity had made himself known in such detail that proximity could be faked. In each case, the vulnerability was not hidden. It was structural. It was produced by the same forces that produce the wealth itself. The necessity of delegation, the cultivation of trust, the accumulation of objects and relationships and infrastructure beyond the capacity of any single consciousness to hold and monitor simultaneously. Think about what this means in practice. When Ryoichi Sasakawa's household grew to the scale it eventually reached, the growth itself was the product of success. Each acquisition, each new property, each trusted employee added to the staff represented the outward expression of a fortune's natural tendency to expand. The collection grew because wealth, left to its own devices, collects. The staff grew because a growing collection requires growing maintenance. The systems grew more complex because complexity is the natural response to complexity. None of this was malicious. All of it was, from a certain angle, inevitable. And yet, every dimension along which the household grew was also a dimension along which its vulnerability grew. Every new object was an object that could become invisible against the background of other objects. Every new trusted employee was a person whose access and knowledge increased even as the capacity to monitor that access and knowledge remained finite. The perimeter of the empire expanded, and the resources available to patrol it did not expand proportionally. This is not carelessness. It is physics. It is the iron logic of large systems. The same logic governed, in different registers, every story in this collection. The Hartenstein family did not fail to hire good advisors. They hired excellent ones. The problem was that the excellent advisors created an excellent system of delegation that created an excellent set of vulnerabilities. The system's sophistication was not incidental to its vulnerability. It was precisely the sophistication, the multiple layers of relationship, the distributed nature of oversight, the complexity of the instruments, that created the spaces in which Garrison moved. Helt's digital life was not insecure in the naive sense. He worked at a technology company with real security practices. He used email systems that met the standards of his era. The vulnerability was not in the infrastructure, it was in the intersection of his legitimate professional infrastructure with his personal life, the moment when he decided, for reasons of convenience and habit, to use his company email address as the recovery address for his personal financial accounts. A decision so small that he almost certainly did not think of it as a decision at all. This is what makes these stories so useful as a collection and so uncomfortable to sit with. None of the victims were fools. None of them were naive about the general idea of risk. All of them had made serious investments in security, broadly understood. And all of them were robbed anyway. Not because their specific security measures failed, but because their specific security measures were designed to address the threats they had imagined, while the threats that materialized were the ones they had not. The deepest insight this anthology offers is perhaps this: the greater the wealth, the greater the necessary surface area of trust. There is no such thing as a $300 million life that is also a fully controlled life. The very scale of such a fortune, the properties, the staff, the advisors, the accounts, the collections, the relationships, requires the creation of structures that cannot be directly supervised. And in the space between supervision and the edge of the empire, the stories in this collection found their room to breathe. The security industry that serves the ultra-wealthy has, in the decades spanned by these stories, learned many of the specific lessons that each case teaches. Household inventories are now, in well-managed estates, maintained as formal databases with regular reconciliation checks. Financial advisors are engaged under documented engagement letters that create paper trails. Digital security hygiene has become a genuine discipline with professional practitioners. Physical security assessments now routinely include review of contractor access records. But the underlying condition, the condition that makes all these specific measures necessary without ever making them fully sufficient, has not changed and cannot change. Wealth, beyond a certain scale, requires trust. Trust, by its nature, cannot be fully verified. And in the gap between what trust implies and what verification can confirm, there will always be room for the kinds of stories collected in these pages. None of this is an argument for crime. It is an argument for humility, the specific, structural humility that comes from understanding that the same architecture of trust and delegation that makes extraordinary wealth functional is also, always, the architecture of its potential undoing. And perhaps there is something useful in that humility, not just for the very wealthy, but for everyone who has ever built a life on trust, who has ever delegated something important to someone they believed in, who has ever discovered that the person they trusted was not quite who they had appeared to be. We are all, in this sense, managing the specific economics of our own small fortresses. We all have vaults we have forgotten to fully describe to ourselves. We are all, to varying degrees, blind to the interior of the systems we have built. The vaults were locked, the guards were positioned, the lawyers were retained, and still, in every case, the fortress had a door it had forgotten to tell anyone about. Those doors are what this anthology is about. And in every case, without exception, the person who found them had been standing close enough to the fortress for long enough to notice something that everyone else had stopped seeing, which is perhaps the oldest lesson in the history of human wealth. The most dangerous person is never the stranger at the gate. It is the trusted face that has been there long enough to become invisible.